And welcome to today's discussion. 2 years after Rana Plaza, we'll maybe let some of the audience to get seated. While you get seated, just let me remind you, I mean, probably you all know by now how this works, but please don't hesitate to ask your questions with the hashtag OECD Pink during our discussion. That would be very good for us to hear from you and what you have to say about this topic. Obviously, you all remember Rana Plaza disaster when a building collapsed over workers from several clothing companies in Bangladesh, leaving more than 1,000 people dead. As consumers, I think we were all shocked because we knew these brands. They are famous for us, Zara, Benetton, CNA. And the questions we're asking today is, 2 years on, what have we learned from Rana Plaza? What lessons from the worst disaster ever in the garment industry? And what has been made to ensure that workers' safety is implemented in Bangladesh, first of all, and maybe we'll talk about other countries. So my guests have all worked on the aftermath of the disaster. We have Joris Oldenziel, is Head of Public Affairs for Bangladesh Accord in Fire and Building Safety. Ineke Zeldenrust from the Clean Clothes Campaign, whom you probably have heard from. And Ben van Peperstrette from the UNI, Global Union. You're the supply chain coordinator. And we have Vincent Brossel, who's France's director for the non-profit organization Peuple Solidaire. So first of all, perhaps I would like for each of you to introduce yourself briefly and tell us who you represent and how you're involved in that particular topic of Rana Plaza. Starting with Ben, maybe.
Yes, thank you very much. Do I have a cable? Yes. Thanks. My name is Ben van Peperstraat. I work as a supply chain coordinator for UNI Global Union and Industrial Global Union. UNI is the global federation representing national federations who organize service workers. So very concretely from this story, commerce workers, the people at the counter at Zara, Inditex, H&M. Globally, and also Industrial Global Union, which is, as the name suggests, an industrial union representing workers in the metal, in the chemistry, and in the clothing sector. And so from how to deal with supply chains, H&M supply chains, both unions look at it from a slightly different angle, and my goal is to work on this from a joint angle. And concretely that translates, on the one hand, both my employers are global union signatories to the Bangladesh Accord, trying to make animu to the workers' counterside to brands. And also what we're working on very concretely is obviously compensation. Industrial is both together with our partners at the Clean Clothes Campaign leading the Rana Plaza compensation arrangement, the Tazreen compensation arrangement, and so forth.
Okay, thanks. Joyce? You should have your microphone there.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joris Oldenziel. I'm from the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. And the Accord was created just a few weeks after Rana Plaza. So we are also now entering into the third year of the Accord, and it's a 5-year legally binding agreement between brands and retailers and the global trade unions, but also their Bangladeshi affiliated trade unions. And I will talk a little bit more about the progress in terms of avoiding another Rana Plaza and factory fires in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Vincent.
Good afternoon and bon appétit. So I'm Vincent Brossel. I'm the director of Peuple Solidaire Actionnet France. It's a French-based campaigning NGO. We were campaigning already before the Rana Plaza on this textile industry, being a member of the Clean Clothes Campaign. And when this happened, mainly we were part of the mobilization process, especially in France, regarding brands like Auchan or Camailleux or Carrefour, and to ask them to be part of the compensation system. And we were one of the 3 organizations that filed a complaint against Auchan because they were refusing to participate to the fund.
Thank you. My name is Ineke Zelderust. I work as international coordinator for the Clean Clothes campaign. And we've been working on safety, wages, freedom of association, and other labor rights issues in the garment industry for 20 years. And Rana Plaza came following a longer string of fire and building safety incidents in Bangladesh. So since the collapse, we've been working very hard to push for both prevention of further accidents and remediation for the victims concerned. And I'm happy for this occasion to share what we've learned. If we look at also the very recent factory fire in the Philippines, only a few weeks back, with 62 dead, very much resembling what we saw from Rana, that this is not just a Bangladesh problem.
No, there is still work to be done. Obviously, Vincent, can you tell us about the fate of the victims, obviously those who were injured and their family, based on a recent report that you got?
Yes, I think it's fair to start talking about what is the situation of the victims. I mean, let's say the survivors, and the few statistics and information I will give you are based on the work of my colleagues from ActionAid Bangladesh, who made a field survey. They already interviewed in March, I mean 2 months back, 1,400 survivors. What is clear that I mean, for them, I mean, personally, the problem is not finished. 61% still need to go to doctors and NGOs to receive physical or psychological treatments. 59% of them are still suffering from trauma and depression, and it's a big issue. It's not only a physical issue; it's also a psychological issue for the survivors. And I mean, what is positive is that I mean, 70% of them are healed. I mean, they are not suffering from the physical injury they had one year back. So this is the positive side. But for 22% of them, their situation is worse than last year. Only 44% get a new job. So it means the majority are still unemployed, and with a lot of economical problems and facing problems to meet their daily needs. And 2% are now in extreme poverty because they lost their job after the Rana Plaza incident. Just 45, just a few figures more that people feel that they are not strong enough physically and psychologically to go back to work. And they don't find suitable jobs because they were mainly young women without, university or college education, and it has been more difficult for them to find work. When you ask them what their top priorities for 2015, first they say to receive a financial support to get their own business. So few of them imagine that they will restart in the garment industry. Second, they need technical support to start their business. So that can come from the NGOs, for example, for improving their economical situation. And third priority, to get a job, because it's for most of them it's the problem now. And second question that we're asked is what you ask in terms of justice to be done. First, they say that they need a fair and quick compensation for what they lose after the Rana Plaza. And second, they want to see the building owner to be punished. So let's say that first, to get the brands paying what they have to pay, and that this money is fairly distributed, and the second one to get a punishment of the local owner that is, basically has a strong responsibility. So these are a few figures that show that the problem is not at all resolved, and there are still a lot of things to be done. And when you look especially at the psychological matter, it will be a middle and long-term process. And I think that's why the NGOs are still involved, and the government also should be part of this solution for the survivors that were interviewed recently.
You talk about justice. In Ecke this week, formal murder charges were made against 41 people, including the owner of the building, and also a dozen government officials. I guess this was long awaited, like Vincent said.
Yes, I think that's true. So Rana, who owned the building, was also a fairly well-known politician. So I think that brought an extra dimension with it into Bangladesh. And I think it's important to know that actually the industrial police ordered the building closed the day before. And because there were cracks in the building and people had been warning it. And the ground floor housed a bank and some shops. And the 5 garment factories were in the rest of the building. And actually the owners of the garment factories forced the workers back in using the argument that they wouldn't get their pay. They were due their pay a week later if they went into the building. And I think that also goes to an issue that, you know, punishing the owners will not resolve. Because this pay is so low, workers are forced to take that extreme risk because they knew what risk it was, because buildings had collapsed in that particular area, which is basically a swamp before. They felt, I'd rather go in a building and risk my life than forgo the $30 that I otherwise get paid, because they normally live in extreme debt and have to pay off the debt collector or face issues there. So I think that shows the complex of issues here, that if you don't resolve the wage issue, if you don't tackle freedom of association, whereby workers feel strong enough to say, I'm not going in that building, you can't force me, we're going to stay outside. And if you don't, of course, fix the buildings, then ultimately prevention will not work. So from a justice perspective, it's important that the Bangladesh government acts also in the judicial frame, with punishing owners and others. Part of that judicial action should also include compensation for pain and suffering, because the compensation that we've been trying to realize with the Rana Plaza arrangement and at the ILO, and that we called the brands upon, is just compensation for loss of income and medical cost. It doesn't include, you know, the pain and suffering that Vincent described that people had undergone, where you would normally, in our legal system, for example, if a building falls on your head and it is somebody's fault, your payment will be different than if there is an accident that is nobody's fault.
Talking about funding, the clothing companies that were involved, they paid. They gave, or they contributed to $20 million fund. So on that perspective, is that sufficient? I mean, or is that satisfying? And I will ask Joris and Ben to maybe respond to that too. Ineke, yeah.
Okay. Well, what happened is that we sat together with all stakeholders, so brands, indeed, clothing companies, governments and others, and said, we need to at least make this effort for compensation. We all agreed that we needed 30 million. And what we could not agree on up front was who should pay how much out of that 30 million. How much by the brands, how much by the Bangladesh owner, how much by the government. And from our end, as labor and NGOs, we said we want a payment schedule because we want to make sure that we get the money. What we were told by brands and by others, and especially by the brands also, we don't want to do a payment schedule because that means we will make ourselves legally liable in future. We'll make voluntary contributions, and you can rest assured this is such a serious issue, it will be resolved.
Has it?
No. 2 years later, we spent the last 2 years in massive campaign efforts to get financing for an agreed upon plan. So I think the compensation effort in terms of doing all the work to identify the victims, to get them all bank accounts, to get them all medical assessments, to in a correct manner identify who should get how much. So not charity-based, like people who are in the media and look really bad get more than others, which it was like in the past, but a proper system. All that was successful, but I find it shocking that the resourcing of it to this date has not been done. So we still miss 2.3 million, which means that we still cannot pay the victims the last 20% that they are due. And this is a very minor level of compensation. Like I said, this does not include pain and suffering. This is 60% of a very low wage, because that is the international norm. So have the brands paid enough? No, I don't think so. They chose not to agree to a payment schedule. It's 29 of some of the biggest companies in the world that have massive income. If they feel their supply chain partners in Bangladesh should pay, the suppliers and the employees in Bangladesh, they can make them pay if they want to. If that doesn't happen, from our perspective, we're close to them, they're in our countries. The message to the governments here at the OECD meeting is that these are your companies. They have a debt and a duty to these victims, and it's not been fulfilled.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree fully. I reconsider the same thing. 2.3 million after 2 years, because I think we also have to take into account the time elapsed. That the international community of brands who had post-Rana Plaza also publicly been under so much scrutiny, and in that sense needed to tell and told the whole world, okay, don't worry, we learned, we'll turn this page. We'll turn this page around. It's our darkest page, but we can turn it around, and from now on, we promise better conditions globally, but also more specifically. I think then, if you take that sort of whole public momentum of 2 years ago and see that we now have 2.3 million missing, that's not defensible at all. And I think the discrepancy between take any of the brands who are producing there, a Benetton, a Children's Place, and so forth, and you compare it with, for example, any numeric profit margin, volume, and so forth, we're actually talking about peanuts from a brand's perspective. But as Vincent already illustrated, from a victim perspective, or a family of a deceased perspective, this is not peanuts. This is a difference between trying to make with the crumbles a new life or not. It's about what kind of medical assessment do you get, and their time is of the issue. Your perspective on revalidation is time bound. If you have immediately medical assistance, you have much better perspectives on regaining functionality of a limb, if that's possible, than if you wait 2 years because some CEO in any of the companies producing there or being largely present in Bangladesh does not own up to that responsibility. And I also want to highlight what Ineke mentioned, is that this estimate of $30 million US, it's an estimate based on the most minimal category of implementation of the ILO convention. The convention foresees several categories of compensation being calculated on, and this is the most minimal form.
Who made this estimation?
Oh, that's basically a combination of virtually all stakeholders. In the Rana Plaza arrangement, you have everybody, ranging from us, global unions, to local unions, to the brands, to the BGMA as representative of the factory owner. And under the able guidance of the ILO, all technical matters have been resolved, and all of them. And this is not just a calculation that somebody can do on a spreadsheet. This is a calculation that I think has roughly 50, 60 something variables taking into account. Very complex, taking a broad stroke convention and translating it very concretely. How can we use that as a device to make payments? So if you take then that's 2 years later, we're still at this moment. 1 year later, after here in Paris, also at the OECD forum, governments already started complaining and saying, okay, if the sector can't even find 30 million amongst themselves, then we should do things, and then we should step up our game. I think for us that's a clear indication that a voluntary system and a promise-based system clearly has limits that
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work. We need to move to something much more constraining.
Just as a reminder, no international brand was indicted for anything, right, in this disaster? I mean, formally charged of anything?
We try in France, but so far we failed. We tried to go to court. I mean, we went to court and based on the Auchan case. That was clearly one of the French company that has interest in the Rana Plaza. and they were refusing to participate to the funds. And what we did is there is in the French law about wrong and lying on your marketing publicity. So we were saying that they say they have ethical codes and they have a lot of ethical practices in their supply chain, but when you look at the Rana Plaza case, it showed that there is a contradiction. So far it's not succeed, but I think we want to follow up and to see how we can exactly put this issue. No, it's an issue about supply chain. It's not an issue only about victim. It's all a system that is creating this condition. And I think the courts are a good place to talk about that.
So Joris, this is a pretty bleak. How do you say bilan? It's pretty bleak. Huh? Summary, yes, for the 2 years. Does that mean that the companies have not maybe realized fully what needed to be changed or their responsibility?
Well, the accord specifically deals with the sort of prevention part, avoiding another Rana Plaza, and not with the compensation part of the Rana Plaza victims. But I do think that it's very important to, as Ben calls it, to turn that black page and to close that chapter in order for the whole industry to be credible in their efforts to avoid something like that happening ever again. And what we do obviously is focusing on that. And just to give you a bit of an update, more than 200 brands have now signed the accord. So it's really a large number of brands and retailers and smaller companies, importers from all over the world. We often it's often said it's a European initiative, but we also have a lot of brands from the US, from Australia, some based in Asia, Hong Kong. So we have a worldwide coverage of signatory companies, and they all financially contribute to the Accord inspection program. And we have now inspected all the 1,500 factories that are covered under the Accord. So we've inspected them for fire, electrical, and structural safety. And we're in the process of developing corrective action plans in all of these factories. And yeah, we're now getting towards the main challenge, which is, of course, to make sure that these factories actually get remediated.
And that it doesn't happen again. Would you say there has been a before and after Rana Plaza?
Well, I mean, I have to say that there's a large number of factories that are behind schedule. So that is a concern to us, that we can see in the corrective action plans, we set a timeline for all the issues to be corrected. And some of them are for a good reason, because installing a sprinkler installation or importing fire doors can take time, because they all have to be internationally certified fire equipment and stuff like that. But there is also quite some delays which are not justified, and so that is certainly a concern for us. But out of the issues that we have identified more than 80,000 issues that need to be corrected.
And that's just in Bangladesh?
That's just in the 1,500 factories covered by the Accord. And we get reports from the factory owners and the brands about issues that are being corrected. And we call that pending verification. And then once we actually go there and are able to physically verify that it's been corrected, we call it corrected. But about 20% of all the issues have now been reported as being corrected. And most of them are electrical issues. Those are the relatively easy ones, cleaning up wiring, etc. But also that is good news, because many factory fires are originating from electrical hazardous situations. So in that sense, I do think that we can say that we have hopefully been able to already prevent some factory fires. So there is that kind of change, and I also do think that there is a change in mentality and awareness amongst different stakeholders about the need to really improve this. But still a lot needs to be done as well.
And we have a question from the audience: how to ensure that multinationals associate themselves with subsidiaries that conform to labor and human rights laws? How can you force them? You said there was a voluntary basis to the compensation. So is it the same thing for
Yeah, well,
labor laws?
I think one element that is very specific of the accord that we would always highlight is that it's a binding contract between, on the one hand, brands and on the other hand, labor. And so in that contract, it makes a whole set of commitments on the side of the brands very clear and detailed on what is expected from them. And at that point, the moment that there is an issue, let's say, for example, well, in the accord, the brands commit to stay into factories and make sure that they help making those factories safe. And if money becomes an issue, then brands, in the end of the road, can have an obligation to make that financing possible. How they do that, they can choose. They have several strategies to do so, but money should not be a problem. That's the brand obligation. Well, if, for example, in those delayed factories that Joris was hinting at, money appears to be a problem, then there is an issue. But then instead of saying like, oh, it's the right thing or not the right thing, we have a binding document, and we can arbitrate against that, and we can hold brands to account on what their commitments are. And I think that's a huge difference. I think your earlier question, can you sue brands for on laws? Vincent explained what they try to do in France. But I think that's the difference between the current legal framework and what justice means. The current legal framework doesn't always contain that, and especially with something complex like the 21st century globalized supply chain. The current legal frameworks are not adequate to ascertain and precise responsibility to the different actors. And so at this point, if you would ask me if the legal framework, if you can use illegal frameworks, no, but because they're not applicable to what should be the part of responsibilities of brands who source from factories. But that's a different question than should that be, or is that a just thing to do? And then I would say, of course, this is the way that we need to evolve. I think France made an evolution in that sense. I hope other parties will follow, but even then it will become very difficult to come to very precise delimitation of where does one responsibility start and the other end. But if you ask the question how to deal with these issues, fire and building safety or other issues, then we think that the voluntary unilateral way that was the model in the last 20 years has proven that it doesn't work.
And that's where the due diligence law comes in. But first of all, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, I think there was no real union strength in the textile industry in Bangladesh. Has it changed since Rana Plaza?
Yes, it's true that being a unionist in Bangladesh is probably the dangerous thing that can actually happen to somebody. Unions in Bangladesh pre-Rana Plaza were, if it was a real union that wanted to do things, defend the rights of workers, then that was often met by factory management or some state instances by violence, intimidation, or even sometimes death. That was the pre-Rana situation. I think post-Rana Plaza, given the international spotlight, some of that eased. We saw a splurge of factory-level registrations. So we see unions coming up in factories. Roughly 300 factories now have a solid union. But we also see a regression of that promise. We see the organizing slowing down on the one hand, and we also see the response of management to a union in their factory becoming again much more violent and much more aggressive. And I think that's obviously a relationship with also the spotlight fading away a bit now in comparison to just post-Rana Plaza. So there are unions in Bangladesh, especially the dynamic democratic unions. One should admire for the work that they do in some of the most difficult circumstances. But we are in no way in a union situation that we would be familiar with in any of the OECD countries. It's a totally different story there.
So we've talked a lot about the companies. What about the governments? What can they do to ensure that the workplace is safe for workers in the garment industry? Ineke?
Yeah, maybe
the OECD government. Obviously, we're the OECD.
Well, I think what the previous speakers pointed to was the need to set up governance systems for international supply chains, which is very crucial, because take the safety issue. This is an industry, the garment industry knows perfectly well how to operate safely. They just are not applying those lessons and that knowledge. I mean, they've done it for 100 years in Europe, right? Just when they internationalized their supply chains, they left those lessons and that knowledge behind. So,
sorry to interrupt, they say they can't control everything.
That's the thing. That's exactly the point I'm getting at. That part is the governance system is missing to make sure that in a supply chain context, parties take up that responsibility. So what you now see happening is an endless go-around where the different entities in the supply chains are constantly sort of saying to the other party, you have to resolve this. Whether it's prevention or remediation, whether it's paying into the compensation fund or fixing a building. The accord is a really good example of where, because it is a binding contract, and because it has some level of steering on it, at least we have some ways of making sure that parties take their responsibility, but it's really focused on putting the responsibility on the brands and saying to the brands, and then you have to use your leverage with the employers. And that's exactly the point where it's difficult, and that's from my point of view, the reason why the remediation is behind, because then the employers go again and say, well, I don't want to do it, I don't have the money, back and forth you go. I think if there's one thing that governments can do, it is make sure that they indeed build governance systems that have enforceability, and that they assign levels of responsibility to the different entities in the supply chain. And that is something that can only happen at international, intergovernmental level. And I think your earlier question, has things changed since Rana? One of the biggest changes I see is that there is now work done at a sectoral level and at a global level, and that wasn't possible before. Before it was company by company, country by country, and all these brands that now are 190 have signed the same agreement. They swore blind to all of us. We can never collaborate at a sector level. It's impossible. We're each other's competitors. We cannot represent each other. And that has been broken through, right? They have elected representatives in the accord. But if not forced, what you see happening with the compensation again, even the ILO cannot right now do more than neutrally chair. The OECD governments have put out a statement saying, we believe companies should pay. The companies say, well, we're not sure if it should be me or somebody else, and the whole system breaks down again. So I think what governments can do is really prioritize, not for Bangladesh and garments alone, but for this entire supply chain question. Prioritize systems to assign responsibility, to enforce agreements that we've had for a century, the labor law and agreements, this is nothing new, and to follow through, because otherwise people lose confidence. The last 2 million on the compensation is important not only for Bangladesh or for us to stop talking about it, it's important because we need to demonstrate to the world that we can follow through on these things, and that this doesn't become another Bhopal where in 20 years' time it's still hanging over everybody's head.
Can I jump in on that notion of control? Because we have a lot of discussion with brands, and so we often hear or heard that notion, or like, we can't control what's happening in our suppliers, they're independent. Which is a very strange notion, because if we then look at like, I go into any clothing stores, you only see t-shirts with 2 sleeves. And for example, a piece of garment has a very deliberate amount of washing cycles that it can survive, for example. So there's a number of things that get an incredible amount of control. The technical aspect, the price, the cost, the quality, the color, the design, those are controlled meticulously. Same thing with iPhones. If brands couldn't control their supply chain, I don't understand how iPhones could actually work. But no, there they have
but
a
even
very
Apple,
precise.
Remember Foxconn, the
Yeah,
scandal.
exactly.
Even Apple wasn't controlling.
But it demonstrates the
happening in
point
the
that
factory.
brands control the part that they have a desire to control, which is price, quality, lead times, and so forth, and that they have not, at this point, enough incentives to also control for decent labor rights in the factories that are producing that. And at this point, they don't have enough incentive to it. So doing the right thing does not carry enough weight in the decision process of any sourcing strategy of a given brand. So either everybody steps up and we go and raid the headquarters of the brands tomorrow, but I think that's not necessarily the easiest way to do, or somebody compels them to do so. And I think at this point the best form of that regulation will be state and interstate, to also make sure that brands get that level playing field and have the same rules and the same strategy and the same vision. Because I think that's also something that we learn much from the Accord, that it puts 200 brands in the same strategy how to deal with it. Before, one brand wanted to do a training program, the other one wanted to make DVDs, the third one was going to reach out to farmers. Every brand had its own strategy how to deal with a specific risk. In the Accord, we club it and we put it all together into one single normative strategy. You stay in the factories and you help making them safe, and you make sure that the financing is there. It's a very easy recipe, and all have to follow that.
I think we talked a little bit about it, but there is another question from the audience. Is there any way for Bangladeshis to refuse and protest against their working conditions? Can they go on strike? Can they demonstrate?
I mean, they do. I mean, it was said just before that there was a lot of repression on against the unions. So they had little chances to do it. Now there are a little bit more of chances, but still the political context is quite complex and difficult, and there are repression from the local industry. So it's not a matter about refusing to work. I mean, they had this. I mean, thousands, dozens of thousands, millions of young women that are going to the garment industries because they have to find a work. And we will never say that we have to close this industry in Bangladesh because there are harsh conditions, because we don't want them to lose their job. And the local unions are asking for improvement. They are not asking for, foreign investment to go outside of the country. So this is something very, very important. Just to speaking about the political momentum that was created because of the Rana Plaza, it was a global concern, a shock, and I think it has been very important for people at different levels. And I just want to talk a few minutes about France, where a group of members of the parliament, under the pressure also of the civil society and the media that play a very important role, they drafted a law that has been trying to resolve this issue and put a legal responsibility to the multinationals, because there was absolutely no responsibility for companies about what they are, how they work with in the supply chain. And this law has been adopted by the parliament, and now is at the upper house, at the Senate. And the first draft was very good.
Sorry, it's called the due vigilance.
Devoir de vigilance, due diligence law.
Sorry, so mixing the two languages. Yes. Due diligence.
Vigilance and diligence. But I think it's very important because it showed that there was a concern also in the political cycles, and not that the Rana Plaza is just a shock and people saying it's terrible, that we should change something. And what is interesting that it came from members of parliament, but the French government has been very, let's say, negative on this law. And they basically try to kill the law. They did not manage, because there were a lot of motivation from the members of the parliament, and also the civil society was very active. But the second draft was very, less progressive and reducing the capacity for the victims to get access to court and to get a strong obligation for the corporate. So I think it's a result of this political momentum. We should also use new opportunities at different national levels, global levels, and local levels, because the Bangladeshi civil society is also expecting a lot. They have national regulation, but it's not implemented. So we still need to do a lot to support their work to get a real implementation of the national labor regulation in Bangladesh.
I was going to say the due diligence law, that only applies to France, doesn't it?
Yeah, but France is part of EU, and I think there are other countries where there is an ongoing discussion, and we expect that France can be the first country, and all the EU and let's say US and others will follow this trend. and it's going in the right direction. It's an historical trend. I mean, you cannot get a globalization without regulation. It's and it will work only if countries by countries there is a debate, public debate, and that companies understand that it's in their own interest to get ethical practices in their supply chain.
But if I remember correctly, it's pretty vague, this law, right? It says companies should be certain that the suppliers they use, are careful about working conditions, human rights, etc. But how do you force them to?
Yeah, it's true that it's vague. It was the first draft was much better, but it has been basically blocked by the government under the pressure of the corporate lobbies. But I prefer to get something vague that you can use than nothing, and we get nothing before. So now it will be our role to build to oblige the companies to implement it, to get this plan of due intelligence, and also to go to court and asking this law to be implemented in the sense that we will write the law. I mean, not the law, but how to say, the jurisprudence. The jurisprudence will be wrote in court, not in National Assembly.
How does it work, just to remind us?
I mean, going to court if the companies are not doing this due diligence work, and that will be our job.
So is there any chance that this French law could be translated into European law, according to you?
Well, I agree with that. If France takes this first important step, then they will probably start advocating for it to be adopted at a European level to create a level playing field, which I think is a very logical thing to do for France after adopting that law. And I agree with you that I believe it's quite inevitable that there will be more and more of this kind of mandatory due diligence, this kind of development of legislation. And you are right that it is vague, but the whole purpose of having a mandatory due diligence or any due diligence provision is that companies can have to do whatever is in their capabilities to identify, prevent, and mitigate risks throughout their business relationships and throughout their supply chains. And what they have to do, if there is an obligation to exercise due diligence, I think the this one working? Yeah. Is to make sure that that they can show that basically the whole idea of the due diligence is that you can show that you have done whatever could be expected from you. So if there is that you could have known or you should have known, and that's a very normal legal principle. And I think that is also coming back to the OECD, the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. It is a voluntary standard, or it's voluntary guidelines, but it's not. It is a very clear expectation from OECD governments towards the multinationals headquartered in the OECD countries. And it also, in 2011, when the OECD guidelines were revised, the human rights due diligence provision and the provision of due diligence was introduced. It came also from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights developed by John Ruggie. So there's an international agreed consensus that these are the principles that apply. So it is quite inevitable that sooner or later this is the expected behavior from the society towards business, to do whatever is reasonable within their capabilities to identify and prevent and mitigate any risks in their supply chain. And like you say, the actual detail will come from jurisprudence, where in a court, if there's NGOs that think that the companies haven't done whatever they could have done, then they can take them to court and then let the judge be the judge to see whether they have exercised their due diligence appropriately and adequately.
Vincent, is it what is it working? Yes. Is it retroactive, meaning that could people get sued? Could companies get sued for Rana Plaza 2 years later because of this law?
No, I mean, first of all, the law is not implemented. It's still at the upper house, so it will take some time, but we expect few months, but it will take some time. No, it will not be used. I mean, it cannot be used for the Rana Plaza, and also there are some restriction. It should be corporate with more than 5,000 workers in France or 10,000 at the international level. So it's basically the big French multinationals. But I think it's good to start with something, and also to test how the law is working. And after time, we can increase the panel of companies that have to do this due diligence plan. But I mean, the Rana Plaza issue, no, will not be touched by this law.
Yes, I was just going to say, if we have OECD countries' representatives in this audience, it would be interesting to see what they feel they should be doing. So please feel free to discuss with us, but I'm going to ask my guests, what should OECD countries do to make things better? Should they promote this law to be, more widespread in other countries and not just in France?
Oh, I think on the short term, there's still that open standing bill of 2.3 million. So that's if OECD countries really want to do something, I think it's going tomorrow together with the head of state and make phone calls to the companies in OECD, headquarters in OECD, and then fundraise 2.3 million, or maybe look at, I don't know, an unspent budget item somewhere. OECD countries, I guess, have the political legitimacy and political weight to mobilize 2.3 million quite quickly. So that's the easy win to help the sector. But I think then on the longer term, I think the OECD is very well placed as an intellectual think tank with experience on the matter to get that sense of, to get that figure introduced in national legal orders that companies need to do due diligence and can be held accountable to do so. Because how that would take shape, how precise can you do that? That technicality, that's something where the OECD, I think, has a lot of competences, has a lot of experience, and can help guide a harmonized system of how to deal with companies headquartered in OECD countries. Because then again, it doesn't really make sense that, let's say, French companies have a very stringent due diligence requirement. I do think that French companies should have a very stringent due diligence requirement, but I also think that the American companies or the Swedish companies or the Spanish companies should have something similar. Otherwise, we have just the companies with stronger legal requirement are sort of then, how do you say, funding and financing better labor rights for the competitors. Because take, for example, Bangladesh. European companies are there, American companies are there. They're sometimes even in the same factory. If then a European company who signed, for example, the accord, or even an American company who signed the accord, has a binding commitment to, for example, ensure financing is there, and then a US brand who's, for example, signatory to the alliance or not a signatory at all is also in that factory and has no commitment to, for example, finance, very concrete due diligence measure, I would say, then that's quite unfair. So how do we get that collective action problem that the Accord partially solves by having 200 brands there? How do we then force that upon everybody? How do we make that then something for everybody? And at that point, international coordination is the way to go, and the OECD is just happens to be in an excellent position to do so.
I have to say, you were talking about the French companies. It was their main complaint, that it was unfair, because the competition didn't have this kind of law.
Yeah, but they can say that they showed leadership then.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good argument. I mean, for the consumers, I mean, you can say that you have ethical practices. Yes. Ethical practices in your supply chain. It's a good argument, and I will say we are talking only about Western and companies, but I think we should include Korean, Japan, and even China, countries that are also producing at the global level. Because I mean, at this moment, the globalization is for each country. It's not a matter of European and US countries. So I mean, looking at Asia, that are also big producers, we need a movement in the civil society and also at the government level, of course, to take this matter into consideration, and that this due intelligence is not a problem of the European and US industry, it's a problem of all industry.
Yeah, there's one guy we haven't talked about, it's the consumer. It's us. What can we do to put pressure? Sorry? Exactly. Something. Yeah, something. As consumers, yes. What can be done? What is the Clean Clothes campaign? What would you answer that?
Yes, I'll answer that. I just want to really quickly make one final point on what OECD governments can do, because I think, and it goes to, and companies actually as well, it goes to the issue of leverage, because a lot of this is about.
Can you hear Ineke correctly? Yeah.
It's now working. Yeah. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's really important that OECD governments use this particular moment, because the G7 meeting is coming up on the 7th and the 8th. And Angela Merkel has said in response to these questions, she does believe that the issue of compensation for Rana Plaza victims needs to be closed by the 7th, so that's in 4 days' time. So it's a bit a now or never moment in terms of indeed turning that black page. So I'll stop talking about it after this, but I really want to give that one message again across, that if we can resolve this now, it would enable us to move forward on this. Then on the issue of applying your leverage, if I hear that French companies are saying, but what about those other companies, or even OECD governments will say, but what about us only as governments, and what about the Bangladeshi government or other governments? A lot of this is about applying your leverage. If French companies would say, we embrace this as a way forward to actually get a level playing field, to regulate supply chains, and we're going to talk to our the other leaders in our sector from the UK or in Europe, and lead a lobby effort on making this EU level, it would be done tomorrow. That resistance isn't coming from the other parties in Europe, right? That resistance is coming also from within the corporate sector. Same goes for the OECD governments towards the Bangladesh government. I've talked to a lot of the OECD governments. The message on some of these issues, we really need the Bangladesh government to act. In order to make that happen, we need the political capital to be spent in terms of giving that message very clearly to Bangladesh and other producing countries. And we need the brands to also put their money where their mouth is. Because at the end of the day, their leverage is very big, because all they need to do is say, this will have consequences for the business relationship to their employers and to these other countries. And we have seen that happen in extreme cases. But usually those are not cases of human rights. Those are cases where they default on production volumes. Those are cases where actually suddenly the clothes themselves are poisoned. We had that too with the azo dyes, some of the people will remember. That problem was resolved within a month because it caused cancer for consumers. And that's when I get to the consumer issue. I think consumers really have a big role to play in terms of making it clear to companies that they believe they want to buy goods made in dignity and reject the current business model, which is actually preventing us from realizing that. And we haven't really talked about the business model, but the last decade in particular has moved to a fast fashion model where turnaround is everything, competition on price is everything. Your second t-shirt that you buy is cheaper than the latte that you'll get in the store next door. So it teaches and gives consumers only the opportunity to think, oh, let's buy that, I see if I wear it, and if I've worn it 3 times, I already have, sort of made my my investments out of it, right? You don't mind so much. It's very different from having 2 seasons a year, which was what it was like 20 years ago, and buying something and expecting it to last 4 or 5 months at least, or a year. I think that this business model can shift again. It's very recent. And I think the leadership in this industry, once they realize that consumers don't want that business model anymore, they want a different business model, they'll embrace that as the new fashion. And I think that message needs to come across. But at the same time, consumers can only resolve a very limited number of issues. They can set an agenda, they can give a message to the industry, they can't design governance systems. They can't enforce regulation, right? They can't, take somebody to court or make a new law. That they need to hold their own governments accountable to do. And what we need to do collectively is stop this going around where it's always somebody else who needs to do something. But and that again is at the hand of the governments, I'm sorry, because they're the only ones who can, I think, act at that collective level. And
in your campaign, the Clean Clothes campaign, are you appealing to the consumer's conscience?
we, in essence, are a mobilizing campaign that really tries to use the leverage of consumers or citizens. So not just when they go to the store and buy a new garment, but also when you vote, also when you are doing your job as a media person or as any other type of person, to use your identities to say, this century should be about making sure that we shorten global supply chains and that we bring responsibility back, that we know where the products that we buy are coming from, whether it's food or garments or other issues, that people can work in dignity and live in dignity and have a different business model. And I do believe if you have a business model combined with good human rights legislation and enforcement, you can see a very different situation for the millions of workers in the garment industry very soon.
An interesting question came to me. Can governments create a fair trade label for clothing items? But that was already made, right? So is this the failure of the fair trade deal?
I mean, fair trade is functioning for many things, like sugar and rice and quinoa and all the food things. It's functioning very well. For clothes, there is a problem that the clothes now are so cheap that the business model for fair trade clothes is just impossible. Many companies, I mean, small companies with good ideas, they start and they all fail because they cannot compete. I mean, there are so much offer at low price, as it was said, and everybody is looking at the smaller price. So when you do with 100% organic and fair cotton and so on, you cannot compete in the market, or very small niche. I mean, for very nice chic baskets, but it's an issue. I think it's something that should be a thing, and I mean, also government attitude promoting fair trade and putting limits to the importation of some clothes, for example, can be also something interesting. But I think fair trade can be an option, but it's not working so far.
But I think obviously, if governments want to do something, they can. The governments are very powerful. But the question is much more: why would a government want to set a separate circuit of where things would go, of supply chains, where things would be better or equitable? I think our goal is to get the whole sector to a level where human rights are respected in the supply chain. It's not about having then normal trade and then fair trade, or unfair trade and fair trade. It's about getting every single piece of garment that is sold in France, Belgium, Sweden, produced in acceptable, workable conditions that are honorable for the people who also make it. And that's a much more interesting route to spend the political capital on what should a government do than to create another label, because there's already quite a lot of labels, to create another niche.
Maybe if I can add to that, I also believe that just with the example that Ben was giving about the ability to control your supply chain when it comes to safety and quality, with a telephone, for example, mobile phone, every consumer expects that they are protected from a phone exploding in their face, for example, because there's regulation to ensure that the phone is safe and it doesn't explode in your face. The same should be the case with a t-shirt. You should not put that burden, I think, personally, on consumers to be able to choose a t-shirt made with child labor or a t-shirt made without, and a cheap t-shirt with child labor and a more expensive one without. Because then you are really placing a lot of responsibility on the consumers to make the right choice, and inevitably there will be a lot of consumers choosing for the cheapest product. I mean, I think in a way they should be protected by regulation, that there is no choice of t-shirts made with child labor at all. So that there is no choice to go for that very cheap piece. So that there should be a minimum standard that everything applies to. It's similar to what Ben was saying.
Now it's time if you'd like to participate for live questions from the audience. Do you want to add something? I'm sure. No, we still have 30 minutes or so, so we can conclude each one of you. You've asked questions on this, and I thank you. But if you have questions you want to ask.
Yes,
Oh, please
hi.
introduce yourself before.
Okay. My name is Justin, and I work in the Public Affairs and Communications Department at the OECD. So I heard a lot about the international community moving to stop this issue, but I'm just wondering, what has the Bangladeshi government done about it? Have they done anything? And what other Bangladeshi organizations that maybe you work with and that are working in the country to solve this? And do you see a long-lasting solution in these countries without the support of the actual government of the country and the organizations in that country?
No, you can answer that one.
Well, I think the Bangladeshi government, I think first of all we need to note that there is a very intense collusion between, let's say, business ownership and government. It's very unclear to, I think, anybody where one stops and the other starts. Which then also says a bit on in what extent that government is able or willing to act. I think, again, governments are able, but Bangladesh doesn't have a track record in doing so. We're not talking about, we're talking here post-Rana Plaza. That's not an accident that all of a sudden miraculously happened. That's the biggest in a whole set of building collapses, building fires. It's the biggest up to date, but 5 months before we had Tazreen, and then we said, oh, this is the biggest one. And each time that such an accident happened, the Bangladeshi government response, the policy response was, let's have a national action plan. Let's gather everybody. Let's commit to improvement. Things will never be the same. And then they went on with business as usual. I think everybody has a desk at home with filled with national action plans of that specific government that that have no implementation to them. So obviously, indeed, those governments, that doesn't shun them from their responsibility, but at this point, they're not able to do so. At the defense then of the Bangladeshi government, you could also say that obviously they want their main export product to remain in the market. So in that sense, it's just not only solely the government's responsibility. They themselves are equally constrained in, let's say, global capitalism, where brands do look for the most interesting opportunity to find a specific quality of good in a specific time frame for a specific price. And if other countries do better in that race to the bottom, then within this and 10 years, that country can become a major exporter. But at this point, the policy response of Bangladesh has been, we want to be winning that race to the bottom. And I think they're actually winning that in a very impressive, cynically saying, way. So, yeah, they can do it, but they at this point refuse not to do that. Which is also why an accord has been needed, because inspecting factories, that's a key government prerogative normally. That's something that any government should do. But given that the government clearly has not done that and has put consequences to an inspection, because the rules in Bangladesh are quite okay, there is an inspectorate, but then saying like, okay, we find an issue and this is life-threatening and this is the consequence. If you don't deal with this, then we close your factory. That's just not happening in Bangladesh, because in Belgium people are also complaining that sprinkler installations are too expensive. In Bangladesh as well, but in Belgium, if you don't install them at a certain level, then your building is closed. In Bangladesh, that consequence has never been there. So its capacity as a regulator, I think, should be strengthened, and there needs to be political will to do so, and there needs to be political space to do so. But the end goal is that they indeed assume their role as a regulator, but I think they will need a lot of pressure to do so.
Yeah. Just want to really quickly add to that, there's actually not a garment company that we've talked to, and we talk to all of them on a really regular basis, that doesn't agree with this. They know this. They all know this. If you talk to them privately, none of them realistically expect the Bangladesh government to do anything meaningful in this front. And yet, there were 400 garment companies in the mid-90s, and there are 4,000 now. While they actually don't have any infrastructure to deal with that level of increase. And all the companies sit there with the government and the BGME and say, yes, let's double production in the next 10 years. That's the current agenda of the government of Bangladesh, with agreement of all of the major retailers, because it's very cheap. I mean, it is in a way as simple as that. So From our perspective, at this particular point in time, you know, the OECD brands and the OECD governments either say, look, we don't want to contribute to that risky a business, basically, and we're going to take our business elsewhere. Or if knowing all this, you still go in, then you know what's coming. You're going to be held responsible for dealing with identifying all of those risks, well, that's been done, remediating them, and fixing all the problems very, very soon.
Maybe I want to add one more thing, is that because we of course get that question a lot as well, like what are you guys doing, why are you guys doing this government task of inspecting factories? Well, first of all, we also work together closely with the National Action Plan, and they are inspecting all the factories that are outside the scope of the Accord and the Alliance, the American-led initiative. And we are coordinating with them closely and also making sure that the standard is the same. And they are actually visiting our office regularly to see how we are doing things, though there's also a level of technology transfer and technological support that we are providing. So there's some of that going on. But I also think that it's important to note that in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, as well as in the UN guiding principles, it's been stated very clearly that the corporate responsibility to respect exists independently of a state's ability or willingness to exercise its duty to protect. So I think that's where where acknowledgement comes from, that brands still have a responsibility if they are made aware, and everybody was painfully made aware by these accidents, of major human rights risks or life safety risks in their supply chain, that they have to act, regardless of whether or not the state, who maybe be the primary duty bearer, if they are not willing or able to exercise that duty, then there is a responsibility for the brands to exercise their responsibility to respect.
Just a little word, that I think that many governments in the global south, they feel that also they are competing between each other for getting foreign investment, and that make that it's quite. I don't want to give excuses to the Bangladeshi government, but that they have a lot of pressure, because if I mean, investment goes to Cambodia. Now that Burma is open, there are investment in Myanmar and Burma, and we are also talking about garment industry going to Ethiopia, because it is even cheaper to produce over there. So we don't have to blame the government. We have to blame the brands that are doing this type of competition between countries. And it also refers to another issue that is an important issue at the OECD level. It's the tax issue. It's no more the case, but a few years ago, H&M was paying €1 of tax in Bangladesh. They were doing millions of business activities, and they were just paying €1. So it's a matter about the business model of the supply chain, but also where the companies are creating wealth, and do they pay their tax where they are creating wealth. So it's we have to see the global picture, and I mean, if we are changing the rules, it will be good for the Bangladeshi government to get their own resources to develop their country. So it's linked, I think.
Hi, yes, Jennifer Schappert with Responsible Business Conduct here at the OECD. Today we're talking quite a bit about Bangladesh, obviously, because Rana Plaza very sadly happened in Bangladesh, but certainly, as Inika from Clean Clothes mentioned, this could have happened in a number of producing countries. So what is your vision for Philippines, Indonesia, India, Cambodia, and the numerous other countries where fire and building safety continues to be a major risk, and we still see somewhat business as usual and how those risks are being addressed? I'm really interested in what UNI Global, Clean Clothes, and others are thinking there.
Both from industrial and Uniglobal, I can respond that as far as we're concerned, the future does lie in enforceable agreements between labor and brands, and together, not brand by brand, but industry responses, industry-wide bargaining to deal with these issues. Because you only focused even on just fire and building safety, and that's maybe a very tangible strategy, but I think we equally need to deal with the wage issue, the freedom of association issue, because that's even in the accord where we have a right to refuse work, the OHS committees, that whole working with workers to make factories safe, that's not independent from the average remuneration and the FOA context in which such an agreement operates. But as far as we're concerned, the accord structure, unions signing deals with brands and all the same deals to come to an industry-wide response to a specific issue that is, how do you say, the emanation of the supply chain pressure in that specific geography, and then having the tools, the ways to also enforce that agreement, that would be for us the post-Rana Plaza or post-accord way of dealing with labor and human rights issues in supply chains. Sorry? Well, so Industrial Global Union is at this point working on actually an industry-wide initiative with some leading brands on wages as it stands now. So there are discussions with a number of brands that we would consider more responsible and more engaging to have that discussion. So we do have a sort of framework understanding with them. But that's just the beginning of the road. We still need to translate what does that then mean in specific countries. And so, for obvious reason, for example, a country like Cambodia seems a very necessary place to start to bring that kind of methodology, CBAs across supply chains, into practice on wages in a specific context. But as far as we're concerned, we're also still just at the beginning of the road, because our biggest concern at this point is still to make the accord a success, because then you have a workable model, a successful model. We sign an accord, we want to use this one and make that one work, and then afterwards we can gradually go into similar instruments to tackle similar results of brands' current supply chain model.
Thank you. I really want to appreciate what you people are doing, and I think your commitment, passion for that. Isn't this issue we are dealing with a problem which is deep-rooted between what we call as a multinationals trying to get a benefit from cheap labor and from poor countries' situation? And this has been our historical development which has taken place for centuries together. And we have umpteen examples where developed countries have exploited the cheaper conditions abroad. So considering that in 21st century you are dealing with this problem, it's really, I appreciate it. But let's use some 21st century solutions for that. I totally agree that your priority is to get a court settlement, get the remaining money, and give it to the people there. But I think the permanent solution could be to develop a 21st century business model. You should be considering the multinationals who buy the product in their pricing. There is one element they should extra pay for certain better conditions. And that could be a triangular deal between an enterprise, government, and a buyer. Maybe the fourth one will be the buyer's government. And make sure that it's not that easy, but make sure that that is implemented well so that it becomes a permanent one. Maybe one day, if you do it successfully in one country or with one enterprise, it can become a model for United Nations. And there will be agreement like what we have for GATT, what we have in a WTO. And I think those kind of things can be included in it so that you don't have to ask for 20 million at a time or 30 million at a time, but it becomes a sort of a future arrangement. Thank you.
We'd rather not levy a tax at that end. We rather start with good salaries at the factory level.
That can be used for can be used for increasing salary of the people. It could be used as a insurance for the accidents, not for the bad building accident, but for the accidents. Accidents do happen with even Airbus and with the Boeings. So it's the same thing. I mean, you use the model of that of the 21st century. I agree with you. I think salaries is the living conditions of those people is important thing.
Yeah, I want to confirm the importance of looking at also new models to regulate the business practices itself, right? Because often I hear what you're saying, you know, we start from the problem in a way, right? Because as from my own organization, as a solidarity network, that is our point of entry, is our partners in Bangladesh or other countries needing us to help fix a particular problem. But if we don't also look at creative ways to indeed regulate price, to make sure that there is enough financing available in the supply chain to, on a permanent basis, you know, make sure that wages are paid and there is enough of the profit that remains in country, you keep trying to put out fires, for want of a better better term, a better metaphor. And at the same time, I do believe that leads to the problem of scalability. Because my worry is what you say, if we try some practices, and that was also a bit your question, you know, if we try and make the accord work, how do we scale that up, given what we're trying to tackle with so many problems in so many countries? And I do believe that is where we need very strong political messaging, because we had, before Rana, 20 years of CSR, where everybody was always talking about best practices, and we just do a pilot, and then once we've learned, then there would be sort of automatic upscaling across the industry. That automatic upscaling has never happened. Even after Rana, and that's why I mentioned the Philippine Fire or others, none of those brands have thought, oh, wait a minute, now let's, you know, properly do a structural review at all my other suppliers in all my other countries as well and try and fix it. They just sit back again and sort of wait for somebody else to do that. And I think that has finally demonstrably, in the eyes of everybody, I think, proven that they cannot self-regulate. We should not expect them to self-regulate. Right? We can do creative things that need testing out, like the arrangement for compensation. You first need to test out what a proper industry accident system for compensation can look like, right, across the supply chain, because nobody had done that before. But once you know it, there needs to be a mechanism in place to scale it up across the board. And I'm going to differ a bit of opinion with Ben on you know, the ability of us as unions and NGOs to, you know, sort of keep control over that. Because I think it'll take another century if we keep at this pace going, right? So if we want to speed things up, we also need to look at models where we are less in control and where there is another solution for that.
I just want to add one thing in terms of the issue that you're saying, that the root cause is the low prices, or that the prices do not enable factory owners or suppliers to maintain good working conditions. I think in the accord there's a strong provision. It's Article 22, which is a strong supplier incentive, and it basically says that the brands and retailers that sign the accord will negotiate commercial terms with their suppliers for them to be able to maintain safe workplaces and to remediate all the necessary improvements. And I think that is an acknowledgement, in a way, of the fact that on the long term, social and environmental costs, including fire and building safety, but also going forward, not under the accord, but going forward other labor standards, the cost of those will need to be internalized in the price setting and the price negotiations. And I think that is, I mean, to me, to my knowledge, that's a very unique, groundbreaking provision in the accord that the brands have signed up to and are legally bound to make sure that provision is also upheld. And I think that is a good first step in acknowledging that CSR and purchasing practices should be much more linked together instead of being completely separated from each other as they were over the last couple of decades.
Maybe in response to the control.
The debate is starting, yes.
Given that we find that we now have a full-fledged debate with With differences of opinion, I don't think we have that much of a difference of opinion, in the sense that I think when we look at enforceable, it's not necessarily the control. We also at this point are very happy that we delegate a lot of control to the accord bureaucracy or and staff. We have like hundreds of engineers in Bangladesh who actually go and monitor and do the follow-up inspections. And the accord has automatic procedures to also make sure that if there's issues, that there's again that consequence, that culture of there's an issue, it's not according to the norm, well, then there is a consequence to that. And if that consequence is persistent, then, for example, the accord has, for example, in the case of a manifest refusal of the owner to comply with the accord provisions, the consequence is that specific supplier should no longer be eligible to supply to accord signatories. And I think recently that also happened in the MS Cherry case, Mega Schwab case. But where I want to go, I think, or where we want to go as a labor movement, is much more in the accountability of it. That when things go awry and when brand X or Y does say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to finance all my suppliers or make sure that everything is all right in all my suppliers, or in all my suppliers, unions can freely organize. And if then something happens, that we can go back to them and that we have anchor points to come as swiftly and as smoothly to a resolution of those issues encountered. And it's much more the accountability than the control, because we don't have the capacity to control everything in the world. But we do think we are politically and situationally the institution that is well placed to exercise that accountability and to hold the brands to account on their obligations, the one that they de jure and de facto committed to, but also the ones that they should commit to under their due diligence obligations.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so maybe each one of you can take maybe the last question, or take a minute for concluding word.
Yes,
2 questions.
Blake Harwell from Unite Here International Union. We heard a lot this morning about the marriage between capital and labor leading to productivity. And I think we've heard a lot about labor, government. I'm not sure we've heard about capital. Is there a response? Capital also needs to be included in this?
Can you explain what you mean
exactly? Sorry, we missed the morning session.
Capital investment. I mean, the investment community and the people that are funding the factories, funding brands, shareholders, etc. They're also benefiting from low-cost models of business. How are we engaging them in this?
I think one of, obviously, if we have 200 signatories of the accord, it's also because there was a lot of pressure on brands to become a signatory to the accord. And I think one of the more prominent groups that actually helped convince companies that signing the accord is the right thing was notably responsible capital investors. Institutions like pension funds, worker pension funds, state funds who say, okay, we think this is the right thing. We do own X amount of shares in X brand. We think this is the right thing. And in that sense, add a new avenue of pressure of companies to actually become signatory to that specific instrument. That's only specifically to the accord. But obviously that same call of investors reaching out and institutional investors who have significant chunks of the capital of fashion brands and them coming to a broader set of expectations, what do they want those companies to do, would be a excellent avenue to also help that transformation in the sector come across.
Okay, and we have one last question.
Anthony from the French trade union CATC and NCP French member. Let's talk about ILO. Next year there is a big meeting for ILO about global chain value. What do you expect from this meeting? And I know ETUC wants a recommendation about global chain value.
Could you explain what ILO is for people who don't know?
Yeah, it's the International Labour Organization, which is part of the United Nations family. It's basically the entity within the UN that is responsible for developing labour standards and overseeing their implementation. Contrary to other parts of the UN system, this is a tripartite organization, so it includes both trade unions and governments and employers who have to agree on everything before something happens. In answer to your question, I think it's very good that the ILO has put supply chains on its agenda, and in a way we constantly are missing the sort of neutral third party, you know, international overseeing entity in all of our systems who can say, okay, now I'm going to put the brands, the employers, the unions, and all the other people in the room and be the one that will get some collective action going. And everybody wants that collective action. Problem has been the ILO is very slow, partly because of its tripartite nature, partly because of other reasons in providing that collective action dynamic. So what can we expect? What would we hope? What I would hope is for the ILO to really step into this governance gap and lead, because I think there is at least some of the problems that we're facing can be resolved through leadership. For some issues, we in essence have a leadership problem. For other issues, like the business model, there's way more other things needed. Can we realistically expect that? I have my doubts. But of course, trade unions being a part of the ILO, 1/3 actually, and governments being the other third, could lead the way here and provide the necessary leverage to make that happen.
I think the biggest challenge is that, as indeed the ILO has tripartite constituents, there are also national tripartite constituents. So national unions, all our affiliates are national unions, so we don't really have that much of an issue. But if you then look at the employer side, I'm not convinced that let's say the Swedish Business Association is in a position to negotiate on behalf of H&M. So indeed, rather than seeing the ILO as a forum for having that industry-wide bargaining, I think it needs to see how it can lend itself best, as Nick mentioned, in that convener role and create that space for industry-wide bargaining. I think the other thing is that obviously the ILO needs itself also a strategy on that. I think the world of work is incredibly influenced by supply chains. The ILO has a tripartite declaration on that, which I think at the time was groundbreaking, but at this point that instrument is in the meantime the OECD came up, you have the Ruggie principle, so in that sense that instrument does not add value at all. So the ILO also as a convener, as a legislator, and as a place where also conventions get enforced, needs to fundamentally rethink how do we come to our mission in advancing the world of work within that new context of globalized economy. And I think that mission statement, that strategy is crucial to at least start at the ILC. We think, and then I talk only about my two employers, we think that the end of that route should come to a convention instrument, because again we think that we would need enforceability at a given moment. Also of the states, do we do our homework on what is on the convention? So we think that, or we hope that next year at least sets the course for the ILO to get its own roadmap in order, as well as the instrument it uses to put in practice that roadmap.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much, all four of you. The session is now over. Thanks to you for being such good listeners and being so concentrated. And I think we all agree that there is a lot of work still to be done, and it's all a question of political will now to make things go further. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.